Hi, folks, and welcome to the Meaningful Money Podcast. This is session number 410. This is the podcast dedicated to helping you put your finances in order. My name is Pete Matthew, and I'm going to share with you everything you need to know and everything you need to do to secure your financial future. I'm here to help you make sense of money. Here we are once again. Hope you're doing okay. A little bit echoey in here in the new room because, I haven't fixed that yet, but looks great. Needs to sound a little bit better, but it's only because I'm a perfectionist, really. Now, spending is one of our biggest levers under our control. When we're building wealth, well, we won't build wealth unless we control our spending. When we approach retirement, it's really important to understand what our likely spending patterns might be so that we can plan accordingly. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Now, after the main body of the show, I'll look at a review that's been left this week, and that's what we're going to be talking about next week, all the usual stuff. But remember, before any of that, this podcast continues to be brought to you with the help of my friends at 7 Investment Management. They've been helping me out here on Meaningful Money for ages, so definitely check out what they're up to. They're at 7im.co.uk. That's the number 7im.co.uk. Go check them out. Now, spending, by its very nature, is variable. And our spending patterns, mine, yours, will of course be as unique as we are. And as we stand at the threshold of retirement, that can be a bit disconcerting. How do we know how much we can safely spend? Obviously, we don't want to die rich, having not enjoyed life to the full, but neither do we want to run out of money and live out our later years in poverty. So today I'm bringing back repeat guest, the ever-popular Abraham Okusanya of Timeline, who has quite literally written the book on retirement spending and investing. The book is called Beyond the 4% Rule, and I'll make sure that's linked in the notes. Abraham continues to do great work in this whole field of retirement planning, spending, investing, all that sort of stuff. Built a company on it, in fact. So, looking forward to bringing you my conversation with Abraham. Remember, notes, links from the show, they're at the show notes, which is the only link you need to remember, meaningfulmoney.tv, session 410, meaningfulmoney.tv / I think I said that first time, meaningfulmoney.tv / session 410. Here's my conversation with Abraham Okusanya. Well, as ever, it's a real pleasure to welcome my friend Abraham Okusanya of Timeline app, Finalytic, and all-round sort of industry genius, talent, and legend. Abraham, welcome back to the show, mate. How are you doing?
I'm very well, Pete. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me again on the show.
No worries. Well, you're always great value. People love to hear from you. You've always got really great stuff to say. But do you want to just give us a bit of a reminder about, what you spend your days doing these days?
Yeah, sure. Most of my time these days I spend running Timeline, which is the next gen retirement planning software for financial planners. So yeah, we spend a lot of our time trying to build the next generation technology for advisors and their clients.
It's an incredible bit of kit, man. I use it frequently with my clients.
Thank you. You've been one of our early, very, very, very early adopters. So thank you very much for your continued support.
No worries, man. I got foam in that regard. I'm always looking for the next thing. I'm just going to adjust my ISO on my camera there because it's going to blind everybody. The problem with having a slightly less controlled environment for shooting these things is that I'm in my front room and it's a lovely light room, but when I'm recording half-hour interviews, the light changes so often it plays heck with my camera. But anyway, man, look. So I love Timeline because it applies real data and robust evidence-based scientific modeling to really help plan effective retirements. And obviously on top of all that, you're putting out some great content about retirement spending and things like that. And that's really why I reached out to you to ask you back today, because you've written a white paper called Retirement Spending Patterns, Implications for Retirement Income Sustainability. And I think probably this might be one of the key questions of our time, how we can make clients' portfolios last as long as possible and certainly to outlast them. So can you just give us the sort of origin story for this latest paper that you've written, why you wrote it and what it was that you were aiming to achieve in doing so?
Yes, thank you, Pete. So essentially, look, what we're trying to do, people ask a series of questions when they are thinking about retirement. And the first question is, well, how much money do I need? In other words, they think about the size of their portfolio. How much money do I need to have before I retire? And that's a good question to ask, but to arrive at that question, you've got to go back a little bit and say, well, what kind of lifestyle do you need to have or to maintain in retirement? And we've done a lot of work on how to work out once you've figured out once you get to the point of retirement, how to figure out, well, what is the sustainable amount that you can take from the portfolio to last you a lifetime. But there's a major element that's been missing in this conversation. And that is how your retirement spending, how your income in retirement is going to change over what is likely to be, 30, maybe even longer years in retirement. And so the focus of this paper is, well, let's dive headfirst into that topic and look at how typical expenditure pattern changes throughout your life in retirement, because that has a massive, massive impact on how much money you need at the point of retirement, or how much you can afford to take sustainably from your retirement pot.
It's just a massive question, this. So there's a couple of studies, 2 or 3 studies, I think, that you referenced particularly. So can we sort of almost start by kind of summarizing what their findings are, and then we'll unpack it a bit from there? Is that okay?
Yes, absolutely. So I referenced 5 studies actually
yeah.
in the paper, and this is always my approach to anything. Clients don't have a they don't have a clear idea of how their expenditures are going to change throughout their retirement. Financial planners don't have a crystal ball either. And so what should we do? There is all sorts of, confusion and debates and arguments in the industry. And my approach is to always go back to the data to say, what does the data tell us? The data is imperfect, but it's a very, very good starting point. And this data is about behavior. And so a couple of the key studies that I referenced, one is by a couple of PhDs at the International Longevity Center in London. If you want to go and look at the paper, it's called Understanding Retirement Journeys, Expectation versus Reality. And what they did was to look at 2 very large data sets, and what is known as the Living Cost and Food Survey and the English longitudinal study of aging, and called ELSA. So what they did was to look at this very, very big data set, and this is real data about the living cost of people in England, and they track these people every single year to look at how their expenditures are changing, and what they found is simply that from round about age 60, your expenditure starts to drop progressively throughout the rest of your life, basically. So the fundamental finding is that a household that is headed by an 80-year-old will spend about 43% less than a house or a household headed by a 50-year-old. And the progression is very, very, very gradual, in retirement. So that's the first study that we looked at.
That clearly has implications. We'll perhaps come back to those. The other may have said there was 5, but there was an American study as well, I believe.
Yes. So again, this is why I love this, and you can see that I'm really getting excited about this. So I say, well, let's have a look at our friends over across the pond, because one way to really test any idea and any data is to look at whether it holds up in other parts of the world. So I looked at another study by my friend, Dr. David Blanchett, who is the head of retirement at Morningstar, and bingo, similar sort of things using data of people in retirement shows that retirement spending actually decline progressively as people get older. One final point before I shut up is that then I say, well, let's look at those guys. I wanted to use a term that I'm not sure I'm allowed to use on the podcast. Let's look at those weirdos in Australia. Am I allowed to say that?
Well, we'll wait for the flack. If it comes, we'll cope with it. Those lovely.
Let's look at our friends over in Australia. So there was a research by an organization called Milliman, which is an actuarial consultancy firm, and again they find the same pattern. And I tried to push this forward. This is not covered in the paper, by the way. I looked at 10,000 financial plans that have been built on timeline by financial planners. And with one tiny exception, in terms of later life and care costs, which I'm sure we're going to dive into, we see the same pattern from round about the age of retirement, which for timeline is about 63 for a client of a financial planner on timeline. It's about 63. We see expenditure decline progressively in retirement, and so that's what we found.
I mean, it's encouraging, I suppose, that it's pretty consistent all the way around the world, from the UK to the US to Australia. So, I mean, the part of the subtitle of the UK paper was expectations versus reality. That would seem to fly in the face of most people's expectations, I think. Most people think actually their costs are probably going to rise, or certainly perhaps in much later life. And obviously it has implication for planning as well. So, I mean, what do you think most people's expectations are then? Because I'm sure I imagine you would agree with me that most people think differently, as opposed, they're not expecting this sort of slow decline.
Absolutely, you're right. Most people's expectation is, well, I need 25 grand a year in retirement, net of taxes, and I'm going to need that amount of money, throughout my life. And what's more is that the industry leads people to, and maybe even the media, generally there's an expectation around, there's this thing that I call bogeyman, largely around care and end of life cost, where people say, well, when you start to get to a later age in life, maybe 85, maybe 90, you should expect that there's going to be this massive, care cost that's going to blow your finances out of water. And essentially what that leads to is basically people, and again, another research, UK research by the Institute of Financial, by the IFS, shows that people, underspend throughout retirement, and they end up, leaving, this massive legacy, because they overreg their life expectancy and the cost of care in later life. So that's generally the expectation of people, which is very different than the reality.
See, it's interesting, and that I mean, probably is the crux of it, isn't it? Because then the last thing most of us want to do is to die rich, right? We want to either use our money or see others use it by giving it away to family, causes that we care about, and stuff like that. Now, of course, studies tend to, by their very nature, talk about the typical household, the average household, and averages, as we know, cover a multitude of sins and a whole range of actual outcomes. So, I mean, practically, then, if I'm standing at the threshold of retirement and I've got my health and my strength and I've got this finite pot of money, how then should I be thinking about expenditure? Assuming I'm Mr. Average, how then should I be thinking about, well, should I spend more in my earlier years while I've got the strength to enjoy it, understanding that probably that will be offset somewhat by lower spending later? Is there a sort of, what should we do in light of this information, Abraham, I think is what I'm asking.
This is a very good question. So before I answer that question, one digression which I cover in the paper is that the expectation versus reality study actually broke people down into different segments. So, they looked at households that they called, I don't like these terms, by the way, they call them extravagant couple, people who spend, a lot of money. Okay. They looked at, frugal foodies, they call these people, or transport lovers, and people who travel a lot in retirement. And what they found is that for all of these categories of people, the trend is generally downwards, right? In terms of the spending pattern in retirement, people spend less progressively, regardless of the type of household. Another study, which I cover very briefly, but in the paper, but I've since again looked at the study. It's actually by J.P. Morgan in the US, and they looked at J.P. Morgan Chase. They looked at actual credit card spending of different households, and they focused especially on households with over $1 million of assets. And again, they find this trend generally. There is this saying, so coming back to your question, there is this saying in the US mostly, that there are three stages of retirement. There is the go-go phase, no-go phase, go phase, go slow phase, and the no-go phase. And broadly, if you think about, the three decades, that we go through in retirement, you can think about them this way. Fundamentally, the big takeaway from this is that, generally speaking, people should plan and expect to spend a little bit more when they can in that go-go phase of retirement. So rather than talking about, the 4% withdrawal rate, which assumes that your expenditure are going to rise in line with inflation every single year throughout retirement, I think we should be talking to people more about maybe a 5, 4, 3% withdrawal rate. So where we would say, well, actually in the first phase of retirement, the first decade of retirement, or maybe longer, you're going to spend a little bit more. And we plan for that. We're more deliberate about that, and we're more intentional about that, because that's what the data seems to suggest anyway. Then we say, well, in this sort of go slow phase, look, you're not really going to do a massive amount of traveling in your late 70s and 80s. There are health issues that are going to start to creep in. Let's just confront the reality around these things. And then we say, look, later in life, a lot of your lifestyle expenditures are going to, frankly, disappear. So let's fit our plan with realities. Is essentially the big takeaway from the paper.
And that's encouraging to me, because in daily interactions with clients who are retired or are in the process of retiring, that makes actually for a much more logical conversation which people can resonate with, because we live in the present, don't we? And so we think, okay, well, how do I feel now? I feel well. I've got this time on my hands because I'm finally retiring. I've got, I've worked hard to build up assets. I want to enjoy it now. And people just, I think we just intrinsically understand that. So I really like the 5-4-3 idea. I think that's a very, very useful way of thinking about it. Have you just coined that, by the way? Or am I going to be able to sort of point back to this conversation where the 5-4-3 rule of withdrawal has been discovered?
Well, I have thought about it. I'm sure I mentioned in one or two of my presentation, but nobody cares. Nobody listens.
I care, Abraham. I think that's genius, mate. And perhaps we'll go down in history as this is where it was coined publicly first. Now, I think that it just makes sense to me. Draw more while you can. And then dial it back in later years. And then, of course, you can model that and start to see what the impact of that is using apps like Timeline. And I think that makes perfect sense. My mind's sort of abuzz with how I might apply that. One of the benefits of me still being a practitioner is that I learn stuff from people who come on the show and think, right, okay, how can I now sort of get that into conversations with clients? I think it's important in the studies to define what the studies mean by a household, because potentially could that not skew things a bit? Because if we're talking about household spending, and then if somebody who is no longer in a household but is in residential care, presumably that excludes them, does it? And so might that skew things a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can make the assumptions, because indeed you're right, you're spot on that the UK studies, the database doesn't include people living in care. But I like a couple of things that the researchers did was to say, well, okay, let's not forget that there is a meaningful number of people. I say meaningful. There's a small proportion of people who do, who do pay for care costs in their homes. Mm-hmm. And generally, what they did was to look at people age 80 and over, and what they found was that. Care cost is only paid by about 6% of those people. So, and another studies which is related, the IFS studies actually essentially said, well, around 1 in 5 people do stay in a nursing or residential care home in the last 2 years of their lives. So, if you put 100 people in the room, 21 of them will need some kind of nursing or residential home care in the last 2 years of their lives. Sorry, but of these people, of these 20 people out of 100, a third of the 20, stayed for 6 months or more, which means vast majority of those people spend less than 6 months in care, and passed on. So I like to think of care in two different ways to say, well, first of all, a lot of the people who fund care fund this from their residential home, right? So the residential property is this massive asset that we don't tend to factor into retirement spending. So one simple rule of thumb to think about it is, well, that can help. I really do think that should help towards the care cost later in life. So that puts less pressure on the portfolio. And remember, when we're talking about sustainable withdrawal rates or this framework, that framework is specifically designed for the worst case scenario. So this, 5-4-3 rule that I just said, or the 4% rule, is designed to work in the absolute worst case scenario. So I'm thinking, well, in the absolute worst case scenario, I don't want to put pressure on my portfolio to fund, care costs. I want to think of the residential property or some of the residential property as a way to fund that so that I can enjoy my portfolio, even in the bad scenario. Now, the second aspect is, well, reality is that we're not going to get the worst case scenario in vast majority of scenarios, sure, right? In the worst case, in the good scenario, in the median scenario, what you might call the expected outcome, actually if I follow that sustainable withdrawal approach, well, not only am I going to be able to fund my lifestyle, there's going to be some money left on the table to fund care costs. So I tend to think of care costs as lump sum expenditure in the last 2 years of life, or if you want to be a little bit more cautious, maybe in the last 4 years of life, rather than building this, as a sort of permanent, regular expenditure into the plan.
I think that's exactly right, and I do that with clients to say, okay, well, what if I need, as a rule, we will plan till age 100, right, for clients, which is obviously ambitious but possible, and more and more of us are getting nearer to it, sort of thing. But then they say, well, what if I need care at 85? It's like, okay, that's fine. Well, we can model that, but there is no way you're going to need care for 15 years. If you get to the 85 to 100, so it's like, if we're going to model care from 85, then I'm going to bring your mortality rate right back to, to 87, 88, 80, or let's say worst case scenario, 4 or 5 years. And that it makes just a huge difference, because obviously if somebody needs care for 15 years, they're going to spend everything probably.
Yeah.
So it's practical, it's real. And you use the phrase bogeyman, you mentioned it already, for care costs, because it's usually a spectre which ends up being a lot less of an issue than people worry about, right?
Yes, because there's a lot of emotional, because there's a lot of emotional, political, we've politicized these things, frankly, to an extent that it's toxic, because, the reality is that, and let's face it, a significant number of people, I forget the exact percentage now, but, nearly half, if not more, people who end up in care end up being paid for by the government. And so the people who are well off don't like that. There's this class war around it, but the reality is that we can think about this in a more logical, data-driven way. And the final point I wanted to make on this subject is that I am glad that you said that about how you approach it, because guess what? This is what I found when I looked at timelines data of these 10,000 plans that's been built by a financial planner. Round about age 95, we saw expenditure just shot up massively, as it just went up massively. And I was looking at this data and I'm thinking, what's going on here? But, I came to the same conclusion that, financial planners are making a bet. They generally plan, till 99, maybe, 100 for clients. And so they are making this plan on the basis that you're likely not going to live that long. But if you do live that long, then you're going to need quite a big expenditure in the last 4 or 5 years of retirement. And I think that makes sense. So thank you for confirming that you're one of those planners who approach things that way.
Approach things in a common sense way, right? And actually, do you know, financial planning is obviously it's inexact, right? Like all planning, right? But one of the most, just by way of anecdote, really, one of the most important moments for me, fairly early on when I was using planning with a client, I was doing a live plan and with a client. So I made a single change based on what he'd said, a sort of scenario, if you like. Threw up the chart, and it was immediately wrong. And when you could just immediately say, well, that ain't right. Right. And so I said, oh, just bear with me. Let me just see what I've done there. Okay, went back in. Oh, right. I realized what I'd done, a zero in the wrong place or a decimal point or something. It was something dead easy. Went back in, made the change. The chart came up and it was right. And the client, who was board level at a national investment firms, right? So this guy has forgotten more about personal finance than I'll ever know. The man is a genius. He said to me, Pete, you've just told me everything I need to know about your approach to this, because you knew immediately that was wrong. Dependence on tools, planning, projections, assumptions, and things like that they only have any merit as long as certainly the planner and ideally the client as well has an understanding of what the numbers actually mean in practice. It's a sort of, this is deeply practical stuff. We're talking about theories and assumptions and studies and things like that, but it only matters to the extent that it can be applied to people's everyday retirement finances, because, man, money is just, irrelevant except for what it enables you to do, right? It's never an end in itself. It's always a means to an end. That's one of my favorite things to say. And, these studies and these tools, they help good planners and people who want to take control of their own retirement plans. They help us to apply meaningful judgments to this stuff, which I just think is super important. So I think actually, is there anything else that you wanted to add, Abraham? But I think that probably brings us to a reasonable stopping point. Would you say?
Absolutely, I agree. The last thing I would just like to say is, there's a quote in my paper by a guy called Bob Danhauser, and he basically said, retirement portfolios can fail us in two ways. Living cautiously might leave too much on the table when our money outlasts us, but spending too much can mean running out of money before we run out of life. The fundamental thing, as you said, is retirement. Our portfolios, our money is there to help us live our best life. There is no point whatsoever making the grave a richer place, if there's anything like that. Yeah. So I think that as an industry, there's been a lot of focus on people running out. When I looked at this data, I'm thinking to myself, we need to give people confidence. And that's why I like the profession that we're in, that, the work that you're doing with clients, which is, let's help them live their best life, with the financial resources that they have. And part of that is, in instances where it's relevant, encouraging people to spend more and to enjoy their lives and their retirement.
So important. I got one couple who, whenever they feel like they're going to splurge a little bit, they call them Pete purchases. Because I'm the one to send, will you please spend your money? This couple particularly that I've got in mind, they don't have any kids, they've got some charities they want to support, but I'm just like, for God's sake, spend your money. So now they call them Pete purchases. So occasionally they'll email me and say, we've made another Pete purchase, I've just bought a Tesla. so I love that. Abraham, thank you so much, my friend. Thank you for your insight and for your diligent academic approach to this stuff, which gives me a great deal of confidence. And as ever, thank you for joining me today. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
There we go. Interesting, huh? Okay, I think this goes some way, hopefully at least, towards giving ourselves permission to enjoy life early on in retirement. Hopefully it releases some of the sort of low-grade worry that many of us have about care costs in later life. I wonder what your thoughts are, having listened to Abraham and myself. Let me know. meaningfulmoney.tv/session410 for questions and comments to do with today's show. Abraham, I'm sure, will be happy to answer any questions there, as will I. meaningfulmoney.tv/session410. Okay, here is a review. This is from Surely Not. Long-time listener, excellent podcast. I've come to revisit this podcast after having binged through several seasons a couple of years ago. Pete is an inspiration and taught me a lot about managing my own finances and gave me the tools to put everything in place. After a couple of years of passive investing, boring, but that's how we like it, I'm seeing my money grow to beyond what I thought was possible. I've since shared this podcast with family and friends. One of the best investments I could make was in Pete Matthew, and I can't thank him enough. Absolute legend, Jack. Jack, Surely Not. So appreciate you leaving that review, mate. Thank you so much. And if you're enjoying what you hear on the show, do leave me a review. It really, really does help, okay? Just like Jack did this week. meaningfulmoney.tv/love is a place to go to do that. Helps others to hear about the show and to subscribe. Keeps me near the top of the ranking, so it keeps the show nice and visible. Right, next week I'm going to be talking to Dan Garrett again. Dan is the CEO of Fairwill, who I interviewed back in June last year. Specifically, he's coming back to talk about lasting powers of attorney, which are really important but often ignored part of our financial planning. And got a new arrangement with them, which will give you discounts in getting your wills sorted and now lasting powers of attorney. Really exciting stuff. But folks, that's it for this week. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope it was helpful. Questions or comments, meaningfulmoney.tv/session410. Okay, definitely check that out. There's links there as well. Hope you enjoyed it, folks. Thank you so much for listening. I will talk to you next week. Cheers.